That's right. I mean, I see from my dinner.
That's why we set this piano right there.
Yeah, don't even. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. If you don't know me, I'm Tim Schmitz. I'm the interim provost here at Wofford. It is a great pleasure to be able to introduce to you Dr. Lena Hill of Washington and Lee University as the guest of our Women in Leadership group. The Women in Leadership group was organized in 2020 to enhance the campus climate for women by developing leadership competencies, cultivating collaboration, and raising the profile of women's voices in our community. More than 75 members of the group participate in workshops, small group discussions, and a summer book club. I'm strangely nervous up here today. I don't know why. The group also invites distinguished speakers like Dr. Hill to campus. Welcome. Dr. Hill is provost at Washington and Lee, as well as professor of English and Africana Studies. She earned her bachelor's degree from Howard University and her doctorate at Yale. And this is always the paragraph of all your accomplishments that one trips over. But Internationally known as a scholar of Ralph Ellison, Dr. Hill's teaching focuses on African American literature and visual culture. She's the author of numerous articles and essays. She co-authored Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, a reference guide, and was the co-editor of Invisible Hawkeyes, African Americans at the University of Iowa during the long civil rights era. She is author of Visualizing Blackness and the Creation of the African American Literary Tradition, which was published by Cambridge in 2014. She is also the co-editor of another work under contract with Cambridge, the 1940s volume of the series African American Literature in Transition, 1750 to 2015. Dr. Hill serves on several boards, among them the National Humanities Alliance Board and the Modernist Studies Editorial Board. Her work as professor and provost at Washington and Lee has prioritized the support and growth of interdisciplinary programs and the recruitment and retention of diverse faculty. Dr. Hill and her husband, Michael, also a professor at WNL, have two children, a daughter, Caitlin, and a son, Michael Carl. Her talk today is titled, "The Renovation Will Be Televised, a Toolkit for Inclusive Leadership." Please welcome Dr. Lena Hill.
Well, good evening. I know, good evening. It is so good to be here, and I just want to begin by thanking you for coming out. I hear this is the week before spring break. We know what happens the week before spring break. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share time with you. And I also just feel honored to be here to speak on behalf of Wofford's Women in Leadership Group. I was just telling the organizers who invited me that when I received the invitation to come, it felt like perfect timing, like I couldn't say no. I was at the first in-person conference that I've attended since COVID, and so I was already really excited. And that morning, I'd gone to this incredible women's breakfast, a breakfast focused on women's leadership, and I found myself seated next to the president of a university that had just hired a former colleague of mine, a woman of color, who I'd had the privilege of serving as a reference for. And when my colleague had asked me to serve as a reference, as we so often do, she said, well, I'm applying for this VP position, but I probably won't get it. And I said, oh, I think you might get it. And so then there I found myself less than a year later next to this president who was singing my colleague's praises, so excited to have hired this amazing woman who didn't think that she was worthy of the job. That same day, I had attended a panel on institutional history. And like Wofford, WNL has a very interesting and I think rich and powerful institutional history that is relevant today as we think about so many of the issues swirling around us. And I walked out of that panel, was checking my email, and there was the invitation to give this talk. So I thought I have to give this talk. And so I'm really quite thankful for the wonderful introduction by Provost Smits. And I've really enjoyed working with Professor Goodchild, Bop, and Balance. I was gonna say, where is she? Who've been lovely as we've prepared for this. And also want to thank President Sam Hatt for having me. And your campus is just beautiful. So I feel really privileged to come during the spring. Y'all are ahead of us. Everything's in bloom here, so it's been really lovely. I'm from Georgia, so whenever I get closer to Georgia, I just feel good. So it's really great to be here for all of those reasons. So let me say from the outset that I just want to congratulate you for having this group, but for also the leadership that all of you are providing and leaning into the work that we have to do. I want to start there. And then just say that I hope this talk will leave you with some concrete and specific tools that will be helpful, and also maybe when you reflect back on this evening will make you smile as well. That's the goal. And so I'll be speaking from the position of a Black cisgendered woman who is a wife and a mother, but I hope that these remarks will be relevant to all of you, no matter your identity or your background. I hope that there will be aspects of my journey and the tools that I leave you with that will be applicable and useful as you think about your own leadership journey. And I'm also excited that I'm kind of slipping in at the end of Women's History Month. It's like just a few days, but we're getting in there. And I have to say that for me, this month has been filled with incredible opportunities where I have learned so much from brilliant, accomplished women. And I'm going to borrow from them liberally and share with you. And really, I think of it as accepting a baton that they've given me that they didn't know they were passing off. And then I'm going to pass it on to you. So we're all in this relay race together. And I think that if you join me on this final leg, who knows what we'll do. So let's get to it. The title of my talk, as Provost Smith just said, is The Renovation Will Be Televised, a leadership toolkit for diversity. And it intentionally echoes jazz poet Gil Scott-Heron, his 1971 poem entitled The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. His 1971 performance, if you haven't seen it, when you leave here, Google it. But in that performance, he throws down the gauntlet as he urges would-be participants in the Black Power movement to get off their couches and to join the movement, the struggle, through active participation. And with a smooth, bluesy background, this is how it starts. You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. I hearken back to his words because for us in 2022, it feels like everything is televised. If not televised, it shows up on social media in some form or fashion. And it feels like too many of us sometimes do work with an eye toward that kind of witnessing, the sense that we're performing. And performativity can be dangerous. Heron's point was both a call for participation, but also a willingness to participate when there are no cameras. Real work takes place when no one's watching often. And I want to return to this to acknowledge that much of our work indeed will be recorded in 2022, but this cannot be our inspiration, our motivation, or our justification. As we think about the contributions we want to make to improving the world around us, and specifically as leaders in higher education, and that includes all of us, faculty, staff, students, I have to say I'm really glad to see such a mixed group tonight because that's what it's about, all of us figuring out our place in this leadership world. But as we do that, the question is whether we are willing to work, not because it will be televised, but because our deepest held principles and values will not allow us to sit on the sidelines, to sit on sofas, to sit at home wondering if someone else is going to pick up the baton. As we contemplate the answers, we also have to ask what tools we'll need to do the work. And so I thought I'd employ a metaphorical scaffolding. I'm an English professor and I don't get to teach as much as I'd like. So every time I get up with a microphone, I try to squeeze that in. So I thought I'd use the metaphorical scaffolding of home improvement shows. All of us picked up something during the COVID lockdown. So I watch almost no television, but during that time I returned to HGTV. I'd let it go for like a decade. Then I found I really liked it because everything's pre-recorded and you can go through the commercials and have a whole show in like 20 minutes and they're not connected and you don't have to keep up with them. And it's a great way just to wind down with some Skittles and peanut M&Ms and fruit slices. So there, I'm a very healthy person. But I love those shows and I love to see the transformations that happen in those 20 minutes. And I hope this metaphorical scaffolding will organize my remarks in such a way that the takeaways will be memorable and easy for you to apply. And also, I thought it would be really relevant, this scaffolding of renovation for Wofford, because like W&L, right, we are always thinking about how we are working upon a really wonderful foundation, but that we're adding to it and we're thinking about how to improve it and make it stronger. And really, even the richness of this space that we're in this evening makes me think that it's incredibly relevant as we think about the work of enslaved people who contributed to this building and enriches our appreciation for the beauty of this space and the history that we we cannot forget. As poet Nikki Jenny so powerfully declared, the thinking men, and I love that, the thinking men gave us much to be grateful for. So Wofford claims a long history, rich culture, and wonderful opportunities for courageous, inspiring, and enlivening renovation. And that's what I want us to think about this evening. I also like the metaphor because it reminds us that as academic leaders, we almost never start from scratch, even if we'd like to, and sometimes we would like to. We never start from scratch. We're almost always given an opportunity to build onto an existing structure. And whether we are adding or dismantling, refurbishing or building or working within a pre-existing structure, we have to respect what that work means. It's both exciting and daunting, especially when many of the structures that some of us work in weren't built for us. And I think about that a lot at W&L. My first office as dean of the college there is my favorite office space. I think I will never have an office that I love as much as I loved that office. When I was hiring the new dean, I was like, and it's a fantastic office. I think she was like, that's weird. There are a lot of things you could talk about. Why are you telling me about the office? But I love the office. It's in a historical building, and it's the living room. It's the parlor. And so there's a fireplace, and it's just very gracious and inviting. And it's the kind of space I not only like to work in alone, but I like to invite people into. It's the kind of space that I want to have conversations in, and I want to make connections and get to know people in. But it is also the space that was home to not one, but two Confederate generals. And when I first started working at W&L, my parents came to visit me, and my dad walked around my office and he said, "This is awesome. This is what this country is about." And what he meant was that he's a Black man who grew up in the South in Alabama. And as a very active college student at Alabama State, he marched with Dr. Martin Luther King. He demonstrated at lunch counters. He was arrested and jailed and expelled. And in those days, when you got expelled, they published your names, depending on what you got expelled for. They publish your name not only in the paper, but in your local hometown paper. So those who might be interested in that kind of activism would know. And so my dad ended up the Klan came to my grandparents' house looking for him, and my grandmother had put him on a train to Kansas City. So he ended up not returning to school. But seeing me in that office that was not built for the kind of leader that I am made him feel like the activism that he was involved in as a college student was meaningful, and he was seeing it not just in the big picture ways that all of us understand that when we look at our country's past, but right there embodied in his daughter, his youngest, in this office space not built for her. But change happens. My first year at W&L, that office space, that building was renamed for the first woman to receive tenure and be an academic leader at Washington and Lee. So now it's called Simpson House after Pamela Simpson, a renowned art historian at W&L. So change does happen, is happening, and we need not wait for a space built for us to take on new challenges for the good of our institution. So if you're sitting there thinking you're ready to lead, but you've not found the right opportunity, or you're leading, but you need a little refueling, or you're thinking about leading, but you want a new opportunity, or you're simply eager to support a colleague who you think would be good for a position. I'm glad to see men here. I'm talking to you too. I hope that there'll be some jewels that I can give you that are worth thinking about later. So let's think about leadership and renovation. How do you know when it's time to take on or apply for a new leadership role, or to encourage a colleague to seek a new leadership opportunity? Well, first you have to identify the structure that needs renovation, and then ask yourself if you have the qualities to do that work. Maybe you've seen things in your department that need to change. Maybe the curriculum needs revising. Maybe staff portfolios need to be reimagined. Maybe you've identified a number of opportunities for improvement and you wonder whether you're the right person for the work. Maybe you see a colleague who you think is right for the job and you're wondering how to encourage her to take the next step. Well, the first step is to think about the need for renovation and the skills that you have. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen the show Restored with Brett Waterman, but he specializes in bringing historic homes back to their former glory. And he has this love for history that guides his work. So whether you're the homeowner of a Victorian, a mid-century modern, an English cottage, whatever it is. If you want to rebuild while maintaining historic features, Brett is your guy and he knows it. But the first thing he does, and the first tool that I want to offer, is he brings really good eyes to the project, good eyes. And he has the skill and the patience to allow himself to evaluate the total structure and think about what it needs. And as academic leaders, that's what we need to do. We have to bring good eyes to the problem. And we have to do that slowly. Now, I'll tell you, when I entered academic leadership, I was filled with uncertainty. I entered because I was asked as an associate professor to serve on a presidential search committee. And it didn't go smoothly. Our institution ended up being sanctioned by the AAUP. So it really did not go smoothly. Afterwards, our faculty were very upset because the process was flawed in many ways. And that president asked me he came to my office one day, I had no idea what he wanted. And he said, well, I need you to come serve on my cabinet, to be a part of my innermost team. And I thought, oh, okay. I've been at the University of Iowa for about a decade, and I had questions about the process. I didn't know him very well, but what I did know is that I did have ideas for changes that need to be made, and I wanted the best for our institution, but I wasn't quite sure what I brought to the table. So let me share with you some of the questions that I have, because you might have those same questions as you're thinking about leadership opportunities. At the time, my kids were 8 and 13, and I wasn't sure I wanted to radically alter the amount of time I had. Right? I valued my summers. I valued the flexibility that would allow me to go volunteer at their schools. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to give that up. Plus, both of our kids have health challenges. They are both born with sickle cell anemia. So we spent a lot of time in hospitals, and my husband and I had always approached their care as a team. But I was an AM mama there. And I wasn't sure if having a job that was really demanding would negatively impact that work. I'd served as the director of undergraduate studies, which big curriculum, over 800 undergraduates, but I wasn't sure if I'd had enough leadership experience to join the president's office. And my husband and I had always had really equal positions. We were hired together, tenure track, and I thought, what will it do if all of a sudden things become a bit uneven? So those were some of my questions. What I didn't think about then was that I had a lot of strengths that I did bring to the table, but I sort of discounted those. One, I was just finishing the book Invisible Hawkeyes, which really looked at African Americans at the University of Iowa during the long civil rights era, and it actually gained me validity with the campus and community. Well, as a mother of kids with health challenges, I was accustomed to multitasking like nobody's business. Our daughter had just undergone a bone marrow transplant in St. Louis. So right before going up for tenure, I had to relocate for 5 months, spend 6 weeks in the hospital with a 10-year-old going through chemotherapy. And that's where I received my letter for tenure. So I was accustomed to operating with a certain amount of flexibility, but also I love a strict regimen because I always knew that I had to make the most of my time because I never knew when one of my kids would end up in the hospital for a few days. And so that is really helpful in leadership. I'd always been willing to do unglamorous work off stage. And I didn't want to join the president's office just because it seemed to look good. And that also garnered some immediate credibility. I was also accustomed to being the only person of color at the table and being willing to speak up. And I loved our students and I loved the institution. I was committed. And then these two last ones, I always discounted and thought they were kind of gendered. And that was that I'm naturally cheerful. And my colleagues would often describe me as kind, and I was kind of embarrassed by that. But as I've gone along on the leadership journey, I've realized that kindness actually takes work. That you can shoot off an email, fire one off that just says what you needed to say, or you can pause and wrap that email in some kindness to deliver the same news. And that matters as a leader. It matters. And as women, I think we often think that those things don't, but they do. So as I was going through this process, I was fortunate that my husband was really a helpful partner. And the most important thing he pointed out was, how could I pass up an opportunity to be at the table of change if I wanted change to happen? I looked and seen what needed renovating. Now, was I willing to roll up my sleeves and do that work? And I'd be remiss if I didn't pause here and say that as I was thinking and as I've continued to think, I've had a lot of wonderful male mentors. President Bruce Harreld, who first invited me into the president's office, has been an incredible mentor. The president of Skidmore, Mark Connor, who brought me to W&L, has been an awesome mentor, as has Professor Horace Porter, who hired me at Iowa. And I've had great women as well. Paula Krebs and Teresa Mangum have pushed me to the front and given me great opportunities. I like to call out people's names because I think we should give some honor and appreciation to those who've helped us along the way. And so as I made that decision, I realized that the good eyes, that tool that I told you often need on a renovation show, and you need to assess where renovation needs to happen, you also need to assess yourself. You need to show those same good eyes that we often use to problem solve all around us to appropriately evaluate what we might bring to the table. That's important, and it's going to be important throughout your leadership journey. So, the second thing, and this is kind of going along with many of the shows I love. Once you've assessed what needs renovation and seriously considered how your skills or the skills of a colleague might help in that renovation process, you then need to be willing to look underneath the exterior and begin to think about working with a team. Just about every renovation show has a moment where things go wrong in the demolition process. This is the drama, right, of the renovation. There's a crack in the foundation. They plan to remove a wall to give you that great open concept, but it's load bearing. The whole house will fall down if you remove that wall. Or there's termite damage. You never know until they rip things apart, and it's always a commercial break when they call and they're like, I've got some bad news. And then the couple or the person has to decide, am I going to give something up, or am I going to make my budget balloon by $20,000? And in many ways, that seems to be the work of leadership in academia as well. It's asking, once we dig beneath the surface and we see those difficulties emerge, are we willing to make the decisions that are necessary for those fixes? When I began serving as the interim chief diversity officer at the University of Iowa, the president and I began to tour our affinity houses, our houses for our Black students and our Latino students. And at the same time, we were looking at the Center for Diversity and Education, which was our largest center that serves students coming from marginalized backgrounds. And that had been housed in the basement of an old building. So we went around touring these affinity houses, and we realized they were in all kinds of states of disrepair. And we knew that we were running low on funds to get this renovation done. Actually, we're building a whole new space for the Center for Diversity Education. And what those physical buildings represented to many people was a lack of investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus. That the disrepair of those spaces made it seem like we were not prioritizing DE&I work. The problem was the state of Iowa had just radically cut our budget. And so we had to really think, what are we going to do? How are we going to approach this? And what we realized was we could do some kind of surface things for the affinity house, some facelifts, and that was useful. And we figured out how to move forward with the major project for the Center for Diversity and Education. But I also realized there's a lot of work when you look beneath the surface that doesn't take the shape of physical spaces. That's not where everything needs to take place. And so the chief diversity officer would often, every year, would give an annual update. And so as I prepared for that update, I began digging into the data. And I'm an English professor. So digging into the data meant I was working very closely with the people who were gathering the data, and then I was assessing it. But it was useful because I had a lot of questions, and I didn't want people, to think that I was just coming up with things to do based on my own thoughts. But that I was really looking at where we were in comparison to our peers in terms of the numbers of our staff, faculty, and students, and the programs, and the graduation rates, and all those things. I wanted to give that to our community so they would know where we stood as an institution and where we hope to go. And what I discovered, I also made a map of all of the committees and task force and people that were working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I found a lot of people were kind of tumbling over each other. They weren't having clear charges and goals. And there was some squandered talent. And so the first thing I did was to try to rectify that, as well as I was collecting data, also trying to figure out how to give people work that was meaningful. Because when people are willing to give of their time, you want to respect that, and we weren't respecting it. So one of the things I did was to begin to think about how to make the team I was working with more efficient. And I realized I love teamwork. And it was different because as an academic, I loved the solitary space of an archive, being there with some old papers and my little thoughts or my big thoughts. And then taking those ideas, working them into an argument, weaving it together, and then having a finished product. I love that. I feel like excited just talking about it because I don't do it as much as I used to. But in academic leadership, it is so much more about working with a team, and that is so necessary. You cannot do the work alone, and that's any kind of work. And that was one of the things I realized we had to rectify, that we needed to make sure that we were taking people's time seriously. And again, I go back to my favorite renovation shows. Most of them I realize are also people in the South. Aaron and Ben of Hometown, Chip and Joanna, a Fixer Upper, Jenny and Dave Mars on Fixer to Fabulous, and the new one I've discovered, Married to Real Estate with Egypt and Mike. If you haven't checked that one out, that's a good one. All of them are about teamwork, but everyone knows their role and the gift that they bring to that work. And so one of them, and I'll go back to Restored with Brett Waterman, because if you're thinking about a leadership position that may necessitate some renovation, you must be willing to peel back the layers and ask the questions that allow you to go deeper before you bring the team into doing that work. And Brett Waterman's favorite tool is a heat gun. There isn't a show that goes by when he doesn't take out the heat gun, rip off like 20 layers of paint, and show you this beautiful wood beneath. And I like to think of working with a heat gun, because if we want to be a part of a good team, or to organize a good team, or to inspire a good team, we need to peel back the layers and then rebuild. So one last point before I move on this part. If you're currently in a leadership position and you're part of a leadership team, I hope you're also thinking about how to diversify your team. And I hope you're thinking about this, because I can honestly tell you that no team can reach its full potential if it's not diverse, if it's not filled with people who bring different perspectives. I can't tell you how many times I've been at a table with really smart, thoughtful people committed to the institution, thoughtful about making improvement and progress, but everyone kind of has similar ideas. They've all followed the same path in life. They have the same ideas. And everyone knows for creativity, you need people who've had different experiences, who bring a different set of eyes to the same problems. And so we need that for creative spark. And one of the things we've done, I think, quite well at W&L here recently is figuring out how to diversify our campus. But we have to be intentional. So I'm going to share just a few things that we've done and that maybe you're doing, because it's necessary to be really thoughtful. So first of all, it has to start at the top. And I think just looking at your website, that's the case at Wofford. Everyone has to know that those in leadership positions are serious when we want to make these changes in terms of diversification. It can't just be something we say and then we don't actually carry through on. You'll be shocked to discover how many times people who talk about their commitment to certain things in terms of diversity, that then when the rubber hits the road and you're on that search committee, you hear people advocating for hiring a friend or someone they attended grad school with or someone they simply can imagine hanging out with. And you're thinking, wow, I didn't know we were hiring just a friend. But you have to be intentional at the top and then take meaningful steps. So the first thing we did was to establish relationships with HR to make sure we were being consistent across the institution. And we're still working on that. That's something hard. You think you've established a protocol and then you look and it's, everyone may not be following it. Nothing will happen, and this is the second thing, if you don't have a diverse pool. And that can be difficult if you have not been cultivating diverse networks. And for many of us at institutions that are not diverse, a lack of diversity breeds the same, because we know the same people. We don't have relationships with institutions that are diverse. And so it's hard to turn that ship around. And you don't have to try to do it alone. One of the first things we did was we were not a member of the Consortium for Faculty Diversity. I don't know if you're a member of that or not, but it's a great consortium of liberal arts institutions that brings together postdocs and folks finishing up dissertations. The third thing is you have to institute some sort of education, some sort of implicit bias training for search committees. And I tell you, I've not always been a believer of mandatory education because I feel like you should want to be there. But for search committees, I think it's necessary, and it has to be good, and it's done best when the committee does that training together, because the conversations that happen in the room matter. I often felt like I was part of a secret video program when we were having these implicit bias trainings, and people would say things like, well, she doesn't seem to fit. Or a person from a certain culture, she seems kind of boring. Her affect, just, I don't know, it doesn't seem exciting to me. Or I don't know, this person is an internal candidate and they're just a really good person. Okay, that's not a reason we give someone a job. So you want to have, and it's not that any of us are bad people, it's that we don't always know our biases. So we have to do that. The next thing is we have to make sure the search process is one that is not unintentionally biased, does not somehow give a leg up to some people who may just know certain things. And finally, once we hire diverse candidates, we have to think very seriously about retention. We have done a number of things to make sure that we're thinking about retention. And retention is not meant to be 100%, right? Colleagues will have other opportunities that will take them away, and that's something to celebrate. But what we do want is anyone who comes to work at one of our institutions, we want them to have a fantastic experience, that when they go out into the world, they say, I spent X number of years at Wofford and it was amazing. And so to me, that's part of our retention goal. We form faculty and staff support groups, instituted stay interviews, not exit interviews. It's good to have that too, to know why someone's leaving. But before they think about leaving, ask them how it's going. And we have our HR colleagues do that because it's a less pressurized environment and people can be truthful and help us make change while our colleagues are still present so that we can try to retain them. And we've also developed much more intentional mentoring programs, and all of this really matters. So I've mentioned that building a team starts with the top. And one of the things I like to think about is, what does the top look like in academia? And one reason sometimes this can be hard is because the top is not very diverse. And so let's just think about the presidency across America. Now, things have started to change more rapidly after the murder of George Floyd, but unquestionably, there's still room to grow. A 2020 report says that 80% of college administrators were white, and only 13% of executive officers, presidents, were members of racial minority groups, which is not great. But again, change is happening. In 2017, the latest report that is sort of comprehensive in looking at the American college president, 17% of presidents were non-white and 5% were women of color. Now, that proportion was lower when you remove historically Black institutions, but still progress. And another interesting thing about these stats, it breaks down apparently across states in terms of which presidential candidate they voted for. So about 7 in 10 of the states that voted for, 7 in 10 of the presidents hired by colleges in states that were won by President Trump were white, compared to 59% in leaders appointed in colleges of states that were won by President Biden. But when we look at the 18 months after George Floyd's murder, we see some things changing. More than a third of the presidents and chancellors at colleges during that time that were hired came from racial minority groups, and a full quarter were Black. The proportion of Latino presidents grew to nearly 7%, and that's up from 4%. So that's good. Those are encouraging. But what's interesting is the proportion of women who were hired actually declined a little bit, down to 34%, which is still, it's good, but given where we are, not nearly good enough. Now, the women who were hired were more racially diverse, but again, if we want change to happen, we want that change to start at the top. And it's not just about how someone looks. Clearly, we can make good change without hiring someone who is themselves diverse, as long as they are committed to doing the work. But it also matters in terms of who our students see in positions of leadership on our campus. So to make sure that we continue this progress, we must do our part on our individual campuses. Whip out those heat guns, rip away those layers, build good teams, and think about how you're going to make change happen. And finally, the last thing I want to leave us with is we have to rebuild with care. After we've identified what needs renovation and used good eyes, begun the renovation process, we have to rebuild with care, because new materials assembled poorly will not build a lasting structure. Rebuilding with care also involves bringing a respect to our institutions, core values, and a joy to the work that we do. We don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's what I always say. Some want to constantly talk about what's wrong with our institutions, and we have to be frank and truthful. I'm a big advocate of that, but with a constructive purpose in mind. Right? We want to think about our institution's history and the things that we're building on in order to build up, not in order to tear down. And that's the other reason I love this idea of renovation, because we want to be constructive and inclusive in the process, thoughtful in our problem solving, and resolute in our work for finding solutions, rather than being constant gadfly. So I'm naturally a positive person, and I bring that joy to my work because I honestly love what I do. I feel really privileged to get to do the work that I do at an amazing institution. But it's not enough for me as an individual to bring that attitude to work. As leaders, we must figure out how to make the hard work, and it has been hard. If you didn't think it was hard, look at what happened over the past 2 years with COVID, and it was hard and is hard. But we have to figure out how to make it fulfilling and enjoyable for those around us, and especially for those of us marginalized identities who may not find a core group surrounding us that sort of get us. We have to think about how to inspire. And that's been particularly relevant here lately. Teaching our students and not seeing their entire faces has been hard, but it's been great. And I heard you just got past the mask mandate. I was telling someone before the talk, I saw a work study student the day after we removed our mask mandate, and I said, "Oh my gosh, you are so beautiful." I think I scared her, but what I meant was it was just so wonderful to see her entire face. She was very, very pretty. But it was hard at that moment when the joy that we naturally take in the work that we do on a daily basis seemed like part of it was taken from us. And I wanted to be, as a leader, very creative and thoughtful about that, bringing it back. And so one of the things, we always have a retreat for our department heads, and we had to do it via Zoom last year. And so we thought, you know what, let's get boxed lunches, and after the Zoom meeting, invite everyone to pick up the lunch. We had music, and we said, if you're uncomfortable, go back to your office and eat your lunch. But we spread blankets out across the lawn and said, if you want to stay, have lunch on a blanket. So thinking constantly of how can we just do different creative things. For our new faculty, I don't know how many pizza and s'mores nights I hosted at my house with the bonfire, because I was so worried that our new faculty weren't finding community. But then for our leaders, it was also really necessary to think about how to make sure that they understood it wasn't an option. We had to be the people really putting the joy back into things. And so it was kind of silly, but at our, because, all of us have Eeyores in the group. I know, right? You've got one or two Eeyores. But as leaders, you can't allow people to think they have the luxury of relentless pessimism. You can do that when you're at the back. You cannot do that when you're at the front of the line. And so one of the things we did at our retreat, I had this whole section on let's think about morale building. Let's think about what we can do, and quietly to say, you've got to do that work. And so I had this whole PowerPoint with a little candle that was a flickering flame, and how are we going to make it a bonfire? And then you know what I did? I had everyone back over to the bonfire at the house. So it was like symbolic through line. But it was useful to remind leaders that it's up to us to bring the joy to the work. And I'm really fortunate in that I have a great team. I love my office team. When I'm scraping the bottom of my happy bucket, they will bring some fruit slices, the sugary. Do you know what I mean when I say that? Like when you go on a trip and you go to the gas station and the orange flute. I love those things. So they will bring those. But I also have a great group of girlfriends and family who are prayer warriors. I'm a believer. And whether you are religious or not, the important thing is you have to find out who's your tribe. Who are the people who are going to lift you up when you need it? Because leadership can be difficult, and only you know what you need. I grew up in the Black church, so I need a little call and response sometimes. And I have to have a group that's willing to give that to me. So we all have to figure out what we need. And we have to remember the difference between, as we're doing that and bringing that energy, the difference between rebuilding and staging. Because rebuilding with care is different than staging. right? Staging happens and then everything goes away. But when I say that lots of things are recorded now that weren't recorded before, it still is not a moment for us just to think about making a big splash as we do this work, as we try to move our institutions forward, as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in meaningful ways. It's more than for the moment. And one of the things that I have realized is really important is the work that we do off stage and how it impacts what we do on stage. For years in Iowa City, I was giving talks at my kids' middle schools and Black History Month. The moment from MLK through the end of February, my husband and I used to say it was the most exhausting moment of our lives because we would just be all over town giving talks and doing different things. But I actually love that work. And when I moved into higher leadership positions, I realized that I was a nice bridge between certain sections of our community, certain areas of our alumni, because again, they saw that it was real. It was something that wasn't just happening when I was on the stage. And it helped me rebuild in a way that was easier and more enjoyable. But as we're rebuilding, I also say, we can't be afraid to celebrate what we're building, to celebrate along the way. If you have a small promotion, if you move forward in a small way, that is something to pause and to celebrate and to think seriously about. One of the things I loved, and this is from Marjorie Haas, who is the president of the CIC right now, but she was formerly the president of Rhodes College. She talks about walking around her campus when she was president with a watering bucket and a stiletto heel. And she said the watering bucket was to water those things that really, needed extra nourishment, but were wonderful and were really going to be beneficial. And the stiletto was for stomping out the weeds that threatened to choke those good moments of work. And I think we all need a metaphor like that as we bring that joy to our work, as we think about rebuilding and making things that last. We can choose our metaphor, but the point remains that we have to do the work in meaningful ways because ultimately our institutions are comprised of people we care about, our students, our staff, our faculty. We want these spaces to be places where all of us can thrive and more importantly, can impact the world around us because, right, we're not built just for ourselves. We're built to ripple out. And that's what it means to be a serious leader. So if you're beginning to think about your leadership journey, or you are wondering how you can take it up a notch, or you're thinking about how to move someone forward, remember to use those good eyes in two ways, both for renovation, looking outwards, but also to evaluate yourself and those around you. Keep the heat gun handy. Peel back the layers and be prepared to renovate with a team that's hopefully diverse, and bring joy to your work of rebuilding with care. It's really the reason that I love those shows, but also that I love the work that we do as academic leaders, because we actually get to see transformation happen. And when you find yourself moving into a space that you like, make sure you make it your own. Every office that I've ever inhabited since I've moved into leadership roles, I take my favorite photograph of Zora Neale Hurston, who is my favorite author. If you have not read Their Eyes Were Watching God, you are not truly living. But make a space that affirms your values. And I have this picture of Hurston, and it's the side-eye picture. And it's one that you probably think you've seen, but you haven't, because there's one that everyone has seen. It's by Carl Van Vechten, but there's another one that's a little different. And when I'm doing my work, I just look over at Zora, and I'm like, hey, Zora. Because it reminds me of her brilliance and her ability to work with the style of an authentic Black woman. And she just speaks to me. And there are some quotes that she has that are my favorites. And I think about those as I'm doing the work. One is that she often said, I love myself when I'm laughing, and then again when I'm looking mean and impressive. And the other one comes from an essay, her 1928 essay, How It Feels to Be Color Me. And I want to read that quote because I really like it. She's thinking about her position as a Black woman in the U.S., and she declares, even in the helter-skelter skirmish that is my life, I have seen that the world is to the strong, regardless of a little pigmentation, more or less. No, I do not weep at the world. I'm too busy sharpening my oyster knife. So I encourage all of you to leave with your tools, but also with your oyster knife, to go uncover some pearls. Thank you.
questions, and we have microphones because we're live streaming this. So just raise your hand, any question, we'll bring the mic, or you can shout it out if you want. Any questions? Questions?
Oh, there's one.
Oh.
But you're fine.
I was just gonna say, so, just thank you so much. And also, it seems like there's someone who invites people to the table, I mean, s'mores and pizza, and that you were welcoming, you're ready to do work. What do you, and you bring, as you said, such joy, what do you say to students, community members, faculty who understand two things, that change takes time, and that change seems to take a bit more time in academia. So what do you say to students and to community members outside of Washington, Lee, that say change isn't happening fast enough? What do you say about that kind of speed question? Change that just isn't happening fast enough?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a good question because it can be tiring. And the question is really just about, why does change take so much time? Why is it so slow? And it can be slow. And at the same time, as we advocate patience, I always think of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Like, we don't want it to go so slowly. But what I say is that for students in particular, you have 4 years to be an undergraduate. And I want you to enjoy those 4 years and take from this educational experience what all the tools that will allow you to make change happen for the rest of your life. So it's not your job to do all of the work. Because I see now, do we want students to lean in? Definitely. I mean, you learn so much from getting to do all kinds of work while you're a student. But it's not for you to solve all the problems. And I always want to say that and make sure, because I've seen students get really frustrated and burned out, and you only have 4 years. But for others, for community members, for colleagues who get frustrated because they put their heart and soul into different ideas that either don't come to fruition or it's just really slow in happening, I try to point to the concrete things that have happened to remind all of us that change is happening. And that's important. Like when I make a list of the progress that we've made at W&L, I'm very proud. I'm very proud of that work, not because I did it, but because as a community, we have pulled together to make things happen. And sometimes I think people forget. We forget some of the small things. And it's one reason I say celebrate along the way. Celebrate as an institution. List things on your website as they're happening to make sure that even if it's, you hired this many new faculty members, you began this new leadership group for women. All of these things matter. And it's not just about the big things. And I think we too often put all of our hope into one bucket. And that's, I think, unfortunate. Because when we're living and existing in spaces, the small changes actually impact those experiences, our lived experience on a daily basis. And I think it's a mistake to overlook it. And this is just as important, it's disrespectful to those colleagues and students and others who've taken the time to make the small things happen. That's valuable. And I always remind myself and my colleagues, don't fail to show respect for those of us and those of you who are doing the work.
What was your educational path and what was your motivation to keep going?
Yes, thank you for that. So my educational path and motivation. So I attended Howard University as an undergraduate and spent a semester at Williams College as well, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to attend a small liberal arts or historically Black college university. So I made it my business to do both. And then spent a semester in Italy, which I loved and actually ended up being very relevant to the research that I do today. And so it's a good question in terms of, how do we make these decisions? For me, it was, I wanted to have a certain undergraduate experience, and I wanted to go to an HBCU. And so Howard was a really good fit, but I loved my time at Williams as well. And in Italy was great. Ended up going to Yale to do my doctoral work in English. So I was an English major and a biology minor as an undergraduate, which is a little odd, but with the liberal arts institution, you can do anything. And I'd actually spent a lot of time in high school spent every summer at a biochemistry lab at Emory or Morehouse School of Medicine. So I went to a math and science high school, but went on to do my doctoral work at Yale because I wanted to work with some of the faculty there in the areas that I was interested in, which is African American literature and visual art. And I feel really, really blessed by the education I received. And I would say that for me, it was never a question. My parents always let us know that education was really important, but they did a great job of letting us navigate our own path. I never felt pressure to go to a certain school with a certain name or not, or where, they were very open. The only thing they said is that one moment I wanted to study in Japan. I wanted to be a part of the JET program, and my mom said that was just too far. But I think if I begged, she would have relented. So yes, in many ways, I would say my parents were definitely my inspiration.
Thank you, that was great. I know I really enjoyed it. No woman gets to be where they are, without a lot of persistence. So tell us a little bit about your experiences with persistence along the way.
Yes, that is very true. You have to be persistent. And you have to be persistent in moments when you don't think you might have to. I remember in graduate school, I decided we decided to start our family. And so when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was also preparing for my comprehensive exams. And one of the female faculty members said, well, I know you have a lot going on and you may not be as serious. And I thought, I'm serious. Like, what does that mean? Because my stomach is out here that I'm not serious. But it was a good lesson to me because I realized that you often think you'll be supported by some and not others. And often that's not the case. And sometimes those who've had a hard time opening doors for us, rather than wanting to hold the door open, they want you to have that same hard time. It's like I walk 7 miles in the snow, so too should you. So I think it's realizing early on that you have your own values, and those are the values that are going to guide the decisions that you're going to make, because no one can tell you what will make you happy. So you have your career, but you also have your life, and those two things are together. The other thing I would say is we need to ask for what we've earned, and that's been something that you're constantly learning, and I would say I'm still learning. But I remember when I first entered the president's office at the University of Iowa, the position was sort of unformed. My title was Senior Associate to the President, and they just kept adding to it. I can barely remember what it was by the time that I left. But often there were these meetings so there were 3 of us that were Senior Associates to the President. And when I came in, there would be these meetings where I wasn't included. And I thought, well, that's weird. And then I thought, I'm working hard and thinking about how to make this position one that really contributes to rebuilding the relationship between faculty and the administration and thinking about how to push DEI forward. And so I decided to go to the president and ask him, basically to say, like, I want to be in the room where it happens. And he was surprised. And he said, well, you know what? The person who was in your position before, they just kind of loved being in the president's office, and whatever they were asked to do, they did. And they loved going to the box for the football games. And I was like, well, that's not why I'm here. And so it was a good lesson, though, because it taught me that, you have to ask for what you want. And it wasn't that he gave me so many opportunities, but I had to show him that I wanted those opportunities. And sometimes you just have to say, like, give it to me. I'm willing and ready and quite capable of doing this work. But we assume that someone, or at least I would assume that, for any number of reasons, I wasn't being given the opportunity. So a lot of times the persistence is learning your own value and constantly deciding, how can I best give? And so often we're thinking we're asking for something, but really we're just asking for the opportunity to give something. And turning things around and thinking about it that way, for me, has been really helpful.
Last slide is so good.
So what would you say to someone who's like hesitant to become like jump into a leadership position?
I think sometimes we're hesitant because we haven't found what we want to lean into. So you don't necessarily just look for any leadership position. You might be in an organization doing really good work, and you don't have to be the president of that organization to contribute in meaningful, useful ways. So that's the first thing. I think you ask yourself when, as far as leadership, when you think there's an opportunity where you could actually make a difference in the leadership position, not being a part of just the larger organization. And I say that because I feel like, many of us do fantastic work without ever having a title as leader of something. People say all kinds of things. You can lead from behind. All those things are true. But if you find that you're hesitant because you're doubting yourself, one of the things that you can do is to start with, small organizations. A lot of my earliest leadership work was in church. Growing up, being, the president of different organizations, and then as an adult, being the superintendent of Sunday school and all of these things. And you might say, well, is that a big deal? Well, it was a big deal to the young people who I make children's church really exciting for them. But those are also, you're organizing meetings, you're ordering materials, you're putting things together. I've renovated our nursery, like they have pictures of me, like painting the walls, and all of those things are good experience, and they're actually transferable in ways that I think we don't always understand or give ourselves credit for. So you probably have had many experiences, whether it's in your classes or on clubs and athletics, or all kinds of things where we are actually developing useful leadership skills, but we haven't found the space where we want to apply them. So I would say make sure that you're actually giving yourself credit. When I say have a tribe, have your people, talk to others. I have found that sometimes bouncing ideas off of others is the most important thing I can do, because they can point out some of the strengths that I have that I don't necessarily think of as strengths. So that's another important thing. And then look at what needs your help. Look at what needs your help and then give it to that thing.
I think that's all the time we have, but you can join me